Welcome to the Mesh Tent 1, a lightweight mesh shelter designed for the minimalist solo backpacker. The Mesh Tent 1 has a sewn-in waterproof floor, and its fine mesh fabric offers excellent protection against mosquitoes, no-see-ums, and other bugs. The Mesh Tent 1 comes with attached guy lines with line runners at the ridge ends. To pitch it, you will need 4 to 6 pegs, which are sold separately, and either 2 trekking poles or similar support, or 2 fixed suspension points such as trees, posts, or really anything you can imagine. Pitching the Mesh Tent 1. If you're using trekking poles, lay out the Mesh Tent 1 in an open area. Peg the 4 corners. Press the pegs down into the ground at a 45-degree angle until only the top of the peg remains barely visible. Use a rock to press or pound in the pegs if necessary. Adjust one trekking pole to roughly 125 centimeters long and place it with the handle on the ground and the tip in the air about 100 centimeters from the front of the mesh tent. Attach the mesh tent's front guy line to the tip of the trekking pole with a clove hitch or similar knot that is easy to undo but is still secure. Then peg the end of the guy line into the ground. Please note that while you can put the trekking pole tip into the ring at the ridge end, we recommend that you keep the pole away from the Mesh Tent 1, both to provide room for getting into and out of the door and to allow for the addition of a Tarp 5. Adjust another trekking pole to roughly 70 or 80 centimeters, which is fully collapsed on most trekking poles, and place it about 20 centimeters from the rear wall of the Mesh Tent 1. Repeat the attachment process you used for the front guy line. Reposition the pegs if necessary and use the line runners on the guy line to adjust the tension. If your trekking poles won't adjust to that 80 centimeters length, you can use longer length poles quite successfully. In addition, you can use other supports besides trekking poles to set up the Mesh Tent 1. Paddles or branches will both work quite effectively. If you're suspending the Mesh Tent 1, you will need support about 4 to 5 meters apart. Lay the Mesh Tent 1 out midway between the supports, peg the corners, and attach the front and rear guy lines to the supports. Reposition the pegs or adjust the line runners on the guy lines to get the pitch that you want. Using the Mesh Tent 1 with a Tarp 5. Pitching the Mesh Tent 1 first. Pitch the Mesh Tent 1. If you're using trekking poles, use the same setup as you would for using the Mesh Tent 1 on its own. Put the ring at the Tarp 5's front guy line attachment point over the tip of the front trekking pole. Repeat the process with the rear ring. Note that the front and rear rings on the Tarp 5 are marked with red. Adjust the trekking pole placement to optimize the pitch of the Tarp 5, then peg the front and rear Tarp 5 guy lines. For easiest adjustment of the guy lines on the front and back of the Tarp 5, place the guy line loop behind the tip of the trekking pole and then tension the guy line. Peg the remaining guy lines and adjust the pitch for weather conditions and your personal preferences. Pitching the Tarp 5 first. Set up the Tarp 5 with either trekking poles or by suspending it. Set it so that it's about 140 centimeters from the ground at the front and 70 centimeters from the ground at the rear. Arrange the mesh tent so that its front corners align with the front corners of the Tarp 5, and the back of the mesh tent is about 20 centimeters from the rear edge of the Tarp 5. Tie the mesh tent's rear guy line to the tip of the rear trekking pole or to the back ring of the Tarp 5. In windy weather, it's a good idea to loosely peg the Mesh Tent 1's corners. Tie the Mesh Tent 1's front guy line to the tip of the front trekking pole or to the front ring of the Tarp 5 and leave a little slack. If you haven't already, peg the corners of the mesh tent. Adjust the tension of the mesh tent with the front and back line runners. If necessary, adjust the height of the Tarp 5 and the peg placement. rigging the Tarp 5 for bad weather when using the Mesh Tent 1. When using the Mesh Tent 1 and the Tarp 5 in bad weather, you'll need to make adjustments to the pitch based on where the weather is coming from, how bad it is, and your own personal preferences. For more overall weather protection, you can easily lower the sides of the Tarp 5 to 15 or 20 centimeters from the ground by adjusting the length of the side guy lines and/or the peg placements. The mesh tent will stay tensioned, although you may have to adjust the line runners on the mesh tent's front and rear guy lines. In very bad weather, when you want maximum protection, you can peg the rings at the guy line attachment points directly into the ground. This effectively blocks out rain from the sides. This configuration will, however, take tension off the Mesh Tent 1 roof so that it functions as a loose bug net. Bear in mind that this configuration is too low for sitting and that the mesh will make contact with you and your sleeping bag. Have a wonderful outing and enjoy the wilderness, but leave as small of an imprint as possible. Leave everything the way you would like to find it on your next trip. Visit Hilleberg.com to see our entire product range and to find more videos with practical tips. You can also read more about us, including our history, our philosophy, and how we make our tents.